Good morning, everyone, and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name's Jenna, and I'm gardening in Midwestern Ohio in Zone 6A. Every year, I like to do a recap video of my favorite varieties from the prior season's garden. Now, 2024 was a pretty challenging growing season here in Ohio, so I figure the varieties that did well this year can put up with just about anything. Now, before I jump into the specific varieties, I wanted to make a few disclosures. These are the same things I talk about in last year's video. The first is that I am a seed trial manager by trade. That means that every year I get sample seeds sent to me that I grow on and evaluate. Oftentimes these come direct from breeders or big seed companies. So there are times when a variety that I mention may not be readily available from a retail outlet or a seed catalog yet. So think places like Gurney's Seed, Burpee's, Johnny's, or even your local garden center. That's happened a few times in the past. If you watch my other videos, you will see that. But for anything that is available on the market already, I will mention a source in the video. Now, just because I mention a source, that doesn't mean that it's the only place that said variety is available from. It's either the place that I got it from, or it's a source that I know is pretty reliable. Now, another note is to keep in mind that these are my favorites just from 2024. I have been trialing and recording my favorite varieties since 2012. So if you watch this video and you don't see a particular vegetable category or an annual flower and herb mentioned, chances are I have a recommendation from one of my previous trial years. So you can go back and watch the prior year's favorites videos, which I will link in the video description below. I also share a link to a spreadsheet on my blog, which covers all of my trial favorites. And of course, you're welcome to drop a question in the comments below as well. One last note before we jump in. Varieties tend to be regionally adapted, meaning what does well for me here in Midwestern Ohio may not be well suited for a different growing climate. Think someplace like the Pacific Northwest, coastal California, even if they are in the same growing zone as me. Through the years, I've traveled all over the United States, even internationally, and I've seen a few varieties that perform beautifully everywhere, but that is definitely the exception, not the norm. The soil and climate of a growing area are going to massively affect that variety's performance, not to mention the different types of diseases and insect pressures that we have in different growing areas. But without further ado, let's jump into the actual varieties that did pretty awesome this year. So first up was Purple Moon cauliflower. I love cauliflower, but unfortunately, cauliflower does not love my Ohio climate. It is probably the most finicky of all brassicas and is much more sensitive than things like kale, cabbage, collards, or broccoli to swings in temperatures and extreme cold and warm spells. So anytime I find a cauliflower that does well here in Ohio, I'm shouting about it. Very early maturing varieties tend to be my best bet. And I am a sucker for colored cauliflowers. Some of my prior favorites included Clementine, which is a beautiful orange, and Deep Purple, which is a really lovely deep purple color. But this year, Purple Moon dethroned Deep Purple. They are truly both great varieties, but Purple Moon matures much earlier, 62 days from transplant versus 80 days from transplant. And that difference in maturity in my climate can really make or break having success with cauliflower. Because of that short maturity window, I was easily able to get a nice head off of this variety, both in the spring and the fall. Purple Moon seemed to tolerate temperature swings really well. It tolerated warm weather and lack of rainfall, and it had a really great flavor. Slightly sweet, kind of nutty, with no bitterness at all. I really liked it both raw and cooked. One thing to note is that purple color does lighten up when it's cooked. You can do a quick steam and it retains quite a bit of the purple, but if you cook it longer, it does turn a slightly unappetizing grayish purple, but that's unfortunately the case with all of the purple cauliflowers I tried. Next up is another early maturing brassica, and I will probably pronounce this name wrong, but Farrow cabbage was a winner in my trials this year as well. Farral produced really nice, dense 3 to 4 pound heads, which resisted cracking in the garden. Always nice because that gives me a longer harvest window. I don't have to worry about getting out there and getting all of the heads picked right away. But what I really liked about this one personally is how that maturity timeline fits right in between two of my other favorite cabbage varieties. So every year I tend to grow Tiara, which is a small, like 2-poundish head, and that matures about a week earlier. Next would fall Farral. It's slightly later, slightly bigger. And then finally is a variety called Slaw Master, which again, about a week later than Farral and about a 5-pound head. So I can get a perfect succession harvest if I plant all 3 of these varieties at the same time. I found that Farral had a really nice flavor and texture. Slightly sweet, but just a little bit peppery, a good crisp, juicy crunch. This one was really good raw, shredded into like coleslaws. I also really liked it braised or sauteed or grilled. I was able to make sauerkraut out of it, but it wouldn't have been my first choice. I like some of the later, larger cabbages better for that purpose. But overall, cooking, fresh eating, Farral was a really great option. I also wanted to quickly mention another cabbage variety. This one was actually a favorite of mine from back in 2013, but I grew it again this year and I loved it just as much as I did the first time, and that is Caraflex cabbage. Now this one is rather unique. It's a mini cabbage, so it only grows to about 2 pounds and it has this unique pointed head shape. But this one is just a fabulous fresh eating cabbage. It is tender, sweet, crunchy, a favorite of mine for things like slaws. It also holds up to 10 weeks, which is a nice long storage period for a sweet early cabbage. Next up, another cool season veggie, and that is Mayan Jaguar lettuce. This was such a gorgeous variety, and I fully agree with Fedco Seeds' assessment of this one. While I've grown a lot of similar splotched lettuces over the years, this one has the most vibrant color definition. I took an embarrassing amount of photos of this lettuce because every time I went out to the garden, it just looked more stunning than the last time I looked at it. I actually didn't even pick all of the heads to eat because they were so pretty. I did justify this by telling myself that I was letting them go to seed so I could collect seed for next year. But I did eat some of them and I was pleasantly surprised with the flavor and texture of this one. It was everything a good romaine should be. Super juicy, crunchy, sweet with a little bit of a peppery finish. Romaines are my favorite type of lettuce, so I'm pretty particular when it comes to romaine varieties. I loved this one. This variety was bred by Frank Morton of Wild Garden Seeds, a man with a real passion for breeding great lettuces. The last I heard, he has over 90 fantastic lettuce varieties to his credit, amongst other vegetables. But I think this one may stand as the best of the best. Next up is a cucumber, but it's actually one that I grew indoors in the winter. So for the past several winters, I have been dabbling with growing cucumber varieties indoors, and Mini Me is my new favorite to date. I originally bought this seed as a variety to try outside in a container, which I never got around to, but that worked out really well for me because when I was selecting varieties to grow indoors, I decided to give this one a try. While it is a full-sized plant, I found that the vines are rather restricted, so they stayed more in that about 4 feet range versus some of the varieties I grow outdoors can get much larger and therefore don't make a great indoor grow. It's also parthenocarpic, setting all female flowers and self-pollinating, so I didn't have to fuss with going in with a little paintbrush or something and hand-pollinating the blooms. And the final great trait for indoor growing is that it's very quick to mature. So I was picking cucumbers within only about a month and a half of planting from seed. This one was super easy to grow. So I've dabbled with other indoor grows during the winter. I've done microdwarf tomatoes, I've done peppers, and cucumbers just in general I find to be much easier to grow than those other fruiting plants are. But best of all was the eating quality of this variety. It's a bait alpha type, which I find to be the very best type of cucumber for fresh eating. So it's very, very crisp, tender, slightly sweet, has a very, very thin skin and no bitterness at all. This was an absolute favorite of my kids. They were actually fighting over who got to eat the cucumbers. And I love that I am able to pick these and just pop them in lunch boxes this time of year when I don't have a whole lot of other fresh produce coming from the garden. Hopping back out to outdoor grows, another trial winner in the cucurbit family this year was the trifecta melon. Cantaloupe type melons might be my most challenging crop here in Ohio. It is very difficult to grow cantaloupe style melons organically in our area between the disease pressure and the pest pressure, in particular cucumber beetles spreading bacterial wilt. It is definitely a challenge. So when I saw trifecta melon being touted as having both powdery mildew resistance and resistance to striped cucumber beetles, I knew I had to give it a try. Now I had 4 different melon varieties in my trials this year. That doesn't include watermelons, as those are a little bit easier to grow here. But even with enormous pest pressure, trifecta was the only variety which gave me fully mature fruit in my garden this year. Had very healthy vines, which yielded a boatload of about 3-pound melons, which is kind of like the Goldilocks size for me. They're not too big, they're not too small. And most importantly, the eating quality was great. Very high sugars, nice, dense, but juicy flesh. They held well. I tend to be pretty particular when it comes to cantaloupe melon flavor and texture, as they can often develop kind of off-putting aftertaste. Sometimes they can seem like they're pretty sweet and then they just finish really flat. And sometimes that texture can get almost so soft, they're slimy. So all of those are just things that I can't tolerate. But this one had really good flavor. It finished really nice and the texture was great. So definitely going to be growing that one again next year. Up next is a summer squash that I've actually grown since 2012, but have somehow never mentioned it in one of my favorites videos. And that is Smooth Criminal Summer Squash. This variety was developed by a breeder in upstate New York and does really, really well here in my Ohio climate. There are a couple of attributes that I really appreciate about Smooth Criminal. The first being that its petioles are completely smooth. So the older I get, the more I have trouble with getting in and picking zucchini and summer squash. If they have any spines at all, they really, really irritate my skin. This one, again, super smooth. Doesn't scratch, doesn't irritate my skin, doesn't scratch up the fruit when I'm pulling it off of the vine. So that's really nice. It also has an indeterminate growth habit. So it kind of puts up this central leader that just keeps growing and it keeps setting fruit along that main stem. This gives me a continual harvest. It also makes this variety really nice for caging or staking. So you can kind of grow it up and keep it off the ground. So you're eliminating some of the issues with things like insect pest and air circulation problems. And because of that indeterminate production, it's just a massive producer. I easily could have gotten away with just one plant to feed my entire family. I planted 3 for some reason in addition to my other summer squash and zucchini, and it was just way too much. But again, a great plant if you're limited on space and you want to just do one summer squash and grow it upright. Really ideal for a small space container, tucking it into any little spare corner of the garden. Now, the eating quality on this one was fine. I trialed hundreds of summer squash and zucchini varieties through the years, and I honestly don't find that much variance in the flavor. Some of the Romanesca types tend to be a little bit firmer, maybe a little bit nuttier, but other than that, they all pretty much taste the same to me. I do like the summer squash because I find that the skin tends to be a little thinner, but honestly, once you've cooked them up, it really doesn't make that much of a difference. That being said, Smooth Criminal was great for eating. I loved it. Grated up into like zucchini bread, made into zoodles, grilled, sauteed, kind of anything that you would typically do with a zucchini. It was great for. I've got 2 more members of the cucurbit family in my trial winners list this year. The first is Lunch Lady Gourd. And this is, again, A favorite from the past that I somehow have never mentioned in a prior video. Since gourds are pretty much a purely ornamental crop for me and they take up a lot of room, they're not something that I grow every year, but I have grown this one about 3 or 4 times in the past, and I grew it again this year. I like to plant them in kind of out of the way places so they don't take up a bunch of my main growing room in my garden. This year, I threw some transplants in an unfinished compost pile that was up against the fence in my main garden, and that worked out really well. If you've ever noticed that your compost pile pumpkins and gourds tend to be your best performers, there is a reason for this. They're very heavy feeders. And they very much appreciate all the nutrients in the compost pile. Planting them near a fence or other support works out really well too. This is a very large, rangy plant, so I had vines climbing all over the fence, up my trellises, everywhere. What I really like about this variety is the variability in fruit appearance that you get from this mix. So all kinds of shapes, all kinds of colors, all kinds of weird, warty skin on different gourds. It's a really neat mixture. The other thing that I appreciate is that this gourd, and really most gourds in general, tend to be more resistant to some of the pests and diseases that typically plague my other cucurbits. So it's a relatively easy plant to grow in the garden with very, very little care. These also store really, really well. So they have super hard rinds or shells, and I had mine sitting outside in a kind of like Halloween, Thanksgiving display for several months after harvesting, and they were still in completely pristine condition until we got really, really cold, like down into the single digits, and then we warmed up again. And that freeze-thaw cycle, they kind of finally bit the dust, and I had to throw them in my compost, but they stood up to everything else up until that point. I also had a pumpkin in my trial winners this year. Again, I don't grow ornamental pumpkins every single year just because they take up space that I usually want to use for edibles. But I had a couple of white varieties that were sent to me in a trial, and I was really pleasantly surprised by how well this one did. Shiver pumpkin is an all-white, medium-sized variety. Theoretically, you could eat it, but it's really bred to be an ornamental. What I liked about this variety is, again, like ease of growth. I didn't have issues with pests or diseases. I got just tons of production off of this one. It's a really nice, pristine white. So sometimes an issue I've had with white pumpkins in the past is they will yellow out in the field. So if they get a lot of sun exposure during that maturity process, they will turn off-white or yellow color, which is not always desirable. If you're looking for a really pristine white, Shiver did really, really well in this regard. It also has nice, lovely, dark, contrasting handles. Just a really cute pumpkin overall. Again, not something I'm going to grow every year, but it was a really fun addition to like those Halloween and Thanksgiving displays. Again, also stores really well. I've still got pumpkins sitting on my shelf here in the house that I can't bring myself to throw away because they look so nice still. I might just paint them up for Christmas at this point. I'm kind of fitting into the same vein with ornamental vegetables. Another trial winner this year was Indian Art Red Fire Ornamental Corn. Now, corn is something that I don't think I've ever actually grown corn variety strictly for ornamental purposes. There are just so many gorgeous flint and dent and popcorns out there that's typically what I'll grow if I want something that I can use both for display and for edible purposes. But again, this is one that was sent to me for trial, so I grew it out, and I was really shocked at how nice it was. This is the first red corn I've grown with such vibrant, uniform color. A lot of times the reds will have darker kernels. They're not nearly as vibrant. They've got a lot of variation in the ears. It also had these beautiful red husks. I also appreciated that this variety had really good tip fill, meaning that the kernels were all the way filled out to the the end of the ear. This is something too that I've noticed with some of the red flower dent corns. They often don't have good tip fill. Now, this can be indicative of poor germination, but it also tends to be linked to varieties. So some varieties are just more prone to poor tip fill than others. This one also had really good husk coverage, meaning that the husks stayed tight around the corn and kept it protected from marauding animals and bugs. Something with older corns I see an issue with a lot of times, where that husk tends to open up around the tip and bugs and raccoons and critters can get in there after the kernels. The plant uniformity of this variety was striking as well. So all the plants were super straight up and down, the same size. The ear placement was at the same spot on all of the plants. This is not a big deal if you're only growing a very small plot of corn. And this is something that commercial growers are usually a lot more interested in than home gardeners. However, I did notice with a relatively large planting, me having to go out and hand harvest this stuff, having those ears at uniform heights made the hand picking go much, much more quickly. Again, this is something that we see a lot more in hybrid varieties, is that plant uniformity. So with some of the older open pollinated varieties, you get a lot of plant height variation. You get a lot of variability with ear position. Again, it's kind of nitpicky, but when it comes to being time saving, it was nice. Now, someone commented on the teaser post that I put on YouTube where I showed a few pictures of the varieties that would be in this video, commenting on this corn about how high the anthocyanin levels must be, which I'm sure is true. Usually with these vegetables that are very dark red or dark purple, that can be indicative of very high anthocyanin levels. But I would not recommend eating this variety. Like, you technically could, but it's probably not going to be very nice. And there are better reds if you really just want a variety for eating. So some of my favorites include Jimmy Red, which is going to make a really nice cornmeal or grits or anything like that. Or if you wanted even higher anthocyanin levels, Montano Morado Maize is an exceptional variety. No red husks on any of those varieties, but still high in anthocyanins. So that's going to wrap up part 1 of my 2024 favorites. But if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to subscribe to my channel, Growfully with Jenna, so you don't miss part 2, which will be out very soon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.